Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, everyone here, thank you very much for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Anas Altikriti. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Cordoba Foundation, your host for tonight. I'd like to thank you all for sparing this evening to join us in this session to address the review announced by Prime Minister David Cameron into the Muslim Brotherhood here in the UK. I'd also like to extend a special message of thanks and gratitude to our esteemed panel for today and all the speakers whom I will in due course be introducing them to you. I'd also like to thank our venue for tonight, the Royal Overseas League. Their facilities have always been outstanding, and it's a pleasure coming back to them. This particular event was found to be extremely important and appropriate for a number of reasons. The concerns regarding this particular review on two main levels. The first, in terms of the content itself, the idea of a review, as was announced by the Prime Minister, the terms, the remit, the mandate of this particular review, as well as the manner in which it was announced and the technical details that make the ramifications of such a review before even the findings are announced extremely problematic. And as an organization, as a think tank that has been working for the past decade to establish a culture of dialogue, of mutual understanding amongst cultures and amongst different ideas, we found this as an important discussion to be had with experts, with individuals who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the subject of this particular review, so that we can come to understand further the review itself, the technical aspects and details, what is expected of it, the implications of this particular method, and where we can move forward, how we can move forward, and what we can come to expect in the future, regardless of the findings of this particular review. Now, I think it's important to announce that something that I've been told time and time again, and particularly today, is that the Cordoba Foundation is often associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's often accused, in fact, it was once accused by the Prime Minister himself, when leader of the opposition, of being in front of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think this is a timely occasion to deny all that. We are not affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. We are not a lobbyist or lobbying organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. And by the way, I say that not because there is anything wrong with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's just basically stating a matter of fact. Indeed, and I don't want to encroach too much on what the speakers will say, but we come because the enormity and the significance of this particular issue is quite great. Too much on what the speakers, an organization that has had an impact over the past 80 to 90 years, literally across the globe, one way or another. The Muslim Brotherhood, when we're talking about the organization, we must never neglect that the Muslim Brotherhood is also a representative of an idea, and that idea, if you wish, call it political Islam, if you wish, call it middle path Islam or moderate Islam. It's an Islam that renounces violence, that renounces compulsion, that has had an enormous impact on social, economic, political, ideological and cultural levels throughout the world, but particularly, and this is what maybe we will be focusing on, the Middle East and North African region. And the fact that the government, this particular review, implies that somehow, in some format, the Muslim Brotherhood might be the same and one as those who adopt a nihilistic ideology such as al-Qaeda and others, is truly troubling, quite concerning, and probably even quite dangerous. May I, before I hand over to our first panelists, may I point out that each one of you has received a pack, and within the pack there are several items which I think are worthy of your attention, including the speakers' profiles, the schedule for today, an open letter in today's Guardian, which some of you who might have chosen to pick up a copy on their way, you'd find on page 16, which created quite a wave of reactions in the UK and further beyond, taking from the media interest that we have received throughout the day. There's also a report from Human Rights Watch on the situation in Egypt. We've left you one of our issues of the MENA report from last year on the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. This might be of relevance for today. And other material and writings by various academics and think tanks and the like, which I think that you'd find quite important. Just some additional house rules in terms of today's discussion is being covered by a number of media outlets, and to our friends in the media who have chosen to cover this event, we extend our thanks and welcome. And therefore, we do not operate tonight under Chatham House rules. I would urge you to switch your mobile phones to the silent mode. If you have any questions or in need of any assistance, please, you'll find our stewards and our helpers and volunteers tonight scattered throughout the hall, so please feel free to approach any of them. Now, without further ado, I'd like to move on to the program itself. And once again, I'd like to thank our speakers. We are still to be joined by a fourth panelist. I'd like to start by introducing Maha al-Qazzaz, who is, if I can, I do apologize, but it seems that the printer ran out of ink when it came to my particular copy. But Maha is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and a human rights advocate. She is a spokeswoman for the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, and that is the capacity with which she carries tonight. Her father and brother are both detained in Egyptian prisons following the military coup in July 2013. So I'd like to hand over to Maha to address the audience for 10 to 15 minutes on the Muslim Brotherhood and her particular take on this review.
Thank you, Anas, for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Anas mentioned, I am Maha al-Qazzaz. I am a member of the Brotherhood. I'm a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and over the coming few minutes, I would like to shed some light on who the Brotherhood are, why would many men and women like myself join the Brotherhood, and how the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement is responding to the challenges of today. In 1928, in the context of colonialism, poverty, ignorance, and disenfranchisement, a school teacher, Hassan al-Banna, founded a movement to revive Islamic faith. The movement combines personal development and societal reform to become one of the most powerful political actors in the 20th and the 21st centuries in the Middle East. A movement that believes in a holistic understanding of Islam and does not endorse any particular school of thought. The Muslim Brotherhood, in brief, is a group of people who believe in education, societal engagement, and campaigning as means to instigate change. The reasons that make people like me nowadays and people in the 1920s to join the Brotherhood are the same. I grew up in Egypt. I wasn't born in Egypt, but I grew up in Egypt under Mubarak's rule, surrounded by widespread entrenched corruption, lack of freedoms, nepotism, deep inequalities. Like many young Egyptians, I too yearned for a change. I searched around me and I found what I wanted in the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood provided The Brotherhood were the only ones who held up the economically weakened state of Egypt by providing its unofficial welfare state. I was passionate about the grassroots support activities they provide. They were supporting orphanages, promoting education, and seeking to alleviate poverty. I was personally also equally impressed by their political engagement. The aim of the Brotherhood, as articulated from its inception, was to install a civilian state that upholds democratic principles, respects civil liberties, and advocates rule of law, to pursue an agenda of social justice, equality, and freedom. The Muslim Brotherhood never advocated for a theocracy, nor campaigned for one. Democracy for the Brotherhood is not a tactic. Democracy is key to its ideology, because whether in matters of faith or matters of society, the freedom to choose is a fundamental part of Islam as understood by the Muslim Brotherhood. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, said, "Freedom is an obligation." Hassan al-Banna himself participated in parliamentary elections in 1942, and the Muslim Brotherhood participated in electoral democracy ever since, whether in unions, syndicates, local council, and in parliament if permitted. Moving to present day, no one can deny the role that the Muslim Brotherhood played in the January 2011 revolution, in terms of mass mobilization, or even providing the basic elements needed for a viable sit-in in Tahrir Square. They provided the makeshift hospitals, they provided the tents, they provided the necessary security for the sit-in. January 2011 revolution and the toppling of Mubarak gave hope not only to the Brotherhood, not only to Egyptians, but gave hope to the world. We had a breeze of freedom that was ecstatic. Everything felt possible. The Muslim Brotherhood, like all patriotic parties in Egypt, participated in the reform process after the revolution. It won 3 elections. It won 3 elections fairly and squarely. Morsi is Egypt's first democratically elected president in its modern history. His only year of presidency was one when no one was arrested for opinions or belief, and no one was above criticism, even the head of state himself. Egypt was still a long way from its democratic ideals, I need to admit. But real steps were taken on the right path to ensure the economic reform and political inclusivity and pluralism. Last summer, almost overnight, the carriage of democracy was hijacked using bullets and tanks of a military leader aiming for nothing but to maintain his and his cronies' economic and political privileges. Freedoms were curbed, journalists harassed and arrested, protests were banned, dissenters, Islamists and seculars alike were imprisoned and tortured. The worst massacres in Egypt's modern history were committed by this atrocious coup regime. Egyptians and sometimes non-Egyptians living in Egypt are facing unprecedented levels of repression. Over 41,000 political prisoners languish in Egyptian prisons, including my own brother and father, like Anas mentioned. Thousands face draconian sentences every day, and hundreds face death sentences without minimum standards of justice required by international law. Egypt now has returned to a state of fear, corruption, and was put back on a path of repression under military rule. We had a year of hope. Then we plunged back into darkness so suddenly. I come to my final part of my presentation. So what is the Muslim Brotherhood doing all about this? What is the Brotherhood doing today? I would like to respond by a famous quote by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mr. Muhammad Badia, who lies in prison sentenced to death like hundreds of other Egyptians, by Egyptian Kangaroo reports. Mr. Badia said, "Our peacefulness is stronger than their bullets. We will continue on the path of civil disobedience, boycotting the roadmap to dictatorship. We will continue to expose the crimes and violations committed by the Sisi military regime to the international community. We will continue to challenge the illegitimate coup in the international courts." The Muslim Brotherhood youth and their supporters are champions of democracy. They should be celebrated, not put under review. They have been protesting peacefully for the past 11 months to bring back democracy, legitimacy, and rule of law. Now, as we speak, the Muslim Brotherhood youth are reuniting and reconciling with other revolutionary forces to bring back democracy and bring down the atrocious military regime. The best example of unity we've seen over the past 2 days in boycotting the farcical elections this week. I would like to reiterate that we, the Muslim Brotherhood, reject the use of violence to bring political agendas. The only violence that has been used was by Sisi and his Fasad to achieve their political agendas. We only engage through democracy, and popular consent is what brought some of us to power. We reject violence against minorities. We reject violence against police. We reject violence against any innocents. We reject violence against all people of faith and none. We reject violence against places of worship. We condemn it, and we are condemning, and we never condone any act of violence. We believe that perpetrators of violence should be brought to fair trials, as fairness, obviously, and justice are important pillars for democracy. I would like to end with a quote from President Morsi's last speech before the coup, which was identical, ironically, to Mandela's quote during the infamous Rivonia trial, when he said, "Democracy is an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt will remain peaceful and will remain defiant, and we will bring our democracy back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muna, and it's always a pleasure having Muna and working with her. I think that she poses quite a striking, poignant figure in this particular struggle, particularly that the plight of her brother, who was arrested alongside President Mohamed Morsi last July, and also her father, who was taken as a result, probably directly or indirectly, of Muna's struggle for what she believes as justice. And therefore our support, solidarity and friendship goes to Muna, and our gratitude that she's able to be with us tonight. Our second speaker for today is someone I'm extremely honoured to have sitting by my side, Lord Ken Macdonald QC. He's the warden of, is it Wadham? Wadham College, and one of the founders of Matrix Chambers. He was Director of Public Prosecutions from 2003 to 2008, the first leading defense lawyer to have been appointed to that particular post. In 2007, Lord Ken Macdonald was knighted for services to the law. The Times editorial described him as an exemplary figure who had transformed his office into a respected public role. And therefore it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lord Ken Macdonald QC.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the Cordoba Foundation for inviting me to speak tonight, and I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to speak very briefly about the United Kingdom government review into the Muslim Brotherhood. As you all know, a few weeks ago, just a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, announced that there would be a government review into the Muslim Brotherhood. And the terms of reference of this review were later set out in this way, that this would be an internal review into the philosophy, activities, impact and influence on United Kingdom interests at home and abroad of the Muslim Brotherhood, and of government policy towards the organisation and the policy of the UK's allies to the organisation. We're told that this is to be an internal review, that it will report directly to the Prime Minister, and it's likely, I suppose, that the Prime Minister will make some sort of public statement about the findings of the review when he receives it. And the timescale is relatively short. The Prime Minister is expecting to receive the report of the review in late July of this year. And as many of you will know, the review team is headed by Sir John Jenkins, who is the United Kingdom's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, which is a country whose attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood is, I think it's fair to say, very well known, or at least the attitude of the Saudi regime to the Muslim Brotherhood is very well known. I think it's important that the review that takes place, that is taking place, bears in mind this simple context. The Freedom and Justice Party was formed in the aftermath of the Egyptian Revolution in April of 2011. In the same year, in 2011, in the Egyptian parliamentary elections, which were considered by all to be relatively free and certainly fair, the Freedom and Justice Party won 47.2% of all the seats, making it by far the largest party. A few months later, the candidate of the Freedom and Justice Party, Mr. Morsi, won the first democratic election, presidential election, that had been ever held in Egypt. And he won it with 51.73% of the vote. That was also a free and fair election. A few months later, in July of 2013, there was a seizure of power in Egypt by the military, and the democratically elected government was ousted. And many of those who had been active in the government were imprisoned under conditions which appeared to be very far from due process conditions, and President Morsi himself was arrested and imprisoned and has not yet been brought to trial. There is another context which I believe the United Kingdom review into the Muslim Brotherhood would be very well advised to take into account. And that is the litany of disappearances, kidnappings, and acts of torture which have swept Egypt since the democratically elected government was ousted. The farce of mass trials, and I speak now as a lawyer, the farce of mass trials, mass sentencings, including hundreds of individuals, some of whom were not even present at those trials, being condemned to hang in, I repeat, farcical court hearings which were so brief that there was no possibility at all the judge had read the dossiers of material that had been prepared for him by the prosecutors. As the Times of London, the Times noted today in its report on the current situation in Egypt, and I quote, "What's happening inside the prisons is taken straight from a torturer's textbook and shows that behind the regime's rhetoric of a roadmap to democracy lies ruthless repression." We all know that today, and I think tomorrow, there is an election taking place in Egypt. And I want to simply read to you a passage from a news report on the BBC website today, and this report is a piece of analysis written by Kevin Connolly, who's a hugely respected BBC reporter. And this is what he writes on the BBC website. "Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, along with the interim government, the official media, and Egypt's powerful army, have been acting for months as though this election was a formality with victory for him inevitable. They may have overdone it to an extent which has alienated some Egyptians and left even those who like Mr. Sisi not seeing much point in voting. At many polling stations," writes Kevin Connolly, "soldiers on security duty have outnumbered voters. And other polling stations have seen no voters at all for hours. Extending voting into a third day might look a little desperate. It's tantamount to an official admission that turnout has been worryingly low for the authorities." Mr. Connolly goes on to say this: "A win for Mr. Sisi on a very low turnout would damage his authority as he takes office. It would be particularly embarrassing for him to secure fewer than 13 million votes. That was the number recorded by Mohamed Morsi, the elected president, whose removal from office was led by Mr. Sisi last year when he was still serving in the army." And I think one can detect from that piece of analysis by Kevin Connolly the differences between this election and the election which resulted in the installation of Mr. Morsi as President. I hope that when the United Kingdom review considers the evidence which is going to be placed before it, including evidence from the Muslim Brotherhood, it will bear in mind three things. First of all, the United Kingdom has a long history of giving refuge to political exiles. Secondly, the British state is committed to a peaceful and democratic politics. Thirdly, the British government is committed to the encouragement of those principles around the world. It seems to me the review might usefully contrast the reaction of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party to the illegal ousting of a democratically elected government. That's to say, a response on their part which is entirely peaceful and entirely constitutional to the behaviour, the frankly unlawful excesses of the military since they seized power in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lord Macdonald. I'm going to take a break from the panel now and open the floor for questions and remarks. We have, I think, one or two roving mics. Abdullah, how many do we have? We have one mic. Okay, can we have it ready, please, if you don't mind? And I'm going to take questions or remarks in batches of 3. Please raise your hands, and when the mic comes to you, and I point to you and the mic comes to you, please state your name, and if you represent an organization tonight, then please mention that as well. Try to be brief, and if you have a question to a particular member of the panel, then please point it out. I have the gentleman here, I have the gentleman in the middle aisle, and I have, if I may, the lady in the second row. So I'll start with the gentleman.
My name is Sakim Sidi. I represent no one but myself, and the question is to Lord Macdonald. How far do you think the Prime Minister might choose to think less of the traditions of this country in light of the UKIP elections, UKIP wins the elections, and try to appease, let's say, the more right-wing among his electorate by seeming to be more aggressive towards the Muslim Brotherhood as an alien Muslim sort of force?
Well, obviously politics in this country are a little strange at the moment, and everyone here will be aware of the results in the European elections. European elections are unusual because they give people an opportunity for a protest vote, which sometimes dissipates before the next general election. To be frank, I don't think that's much of a risk here. I don't think that the government would see a hostile approach to the Muslim Brotherhood as carrying many votes in the United Kingdom, and I say that because most people in the United Kingdom won't be too well aware of what the Muslim Brotherhood is, and I would expect that the government's response to the review report, to Sir John Jenkins' report, will be more guided by strategic questions, where it thinks the balance of strategic advantage lies. On the one hand, the government wants to be seen to be supporting democratic processes around the world. On the other hand, it's got some important allies in that part of the world that are not themselves committed to democracy. And so, in a sense, the government will be trying to square the circle. But those of us who are involved in engaging in the review will obviously be encouraging the government to send out a strong message that democratic parties in a part of the world where there is not much democracy are to be strongly supported and not attacked.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
My name is Mohammed Tahan from the BBC. My question is for Macdonald also. I'd like to ask, does the Prime Minister is free to take whatever decision according to this review, or that these decisions should be put to the Parliament to vote on? Can you explain that to us? This is my first question. My second quick one also, does these decisions could be go with European Union position? We heard recently some positions from the European Union calling what's happening in Egypt as a coup and condemning some practices there. To what extent the Prime Minister decisions could go with the European Union position?
Well, the first thing is the government doesn't need parliamentary approval to announce policy, and this is a policy question. The review is specifically into UK government policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think the Prime Minister has a pretty free hand with his senior advisors to come to his own decisions about what government policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood should be. That's not to prevent people from trying to initiate debates in Parliament so that the matter can be debated, but the Prime Minister can come to his own conclusions. No doubt he'll be guided by his senior advisors in doing that. And I don't think his decisions would be subject to review in the courts unless he took action based on a report that was flawed. Then the action that he seeks to take might be subject to legal review. As for the European Union's position, obviously the European Union is a major player in international relations, and whatever view they take of a geopolitical situation of this sort is going to be strongly influential around the world, and no doubt influential with the British government. I mean, the British government doesn't always agree with an EU position, as we all know, but I would have thought that the EU position would be quite influential here.
The lady here in the second row, can I have the mic?
Yes.
Thank
you very much. Before my question, I would like to make a quick comment here.
Sorry, your name?
My name is Maha Azzam. My question is, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood has been declared as a terrorist group on December last year. We know also on Friday, 7th of March, the Saudi Arabian government declared Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist group beside al-Qaeda, beside the ISIS. And also we know that on Monday, 31st of March, David Cameron ordered the inquiry into the Muslim Brotherhood activities. And surprise, surprise, Sister John Jenkins was the responsible for this investigation. But what is missing here, and I would like really to emphasize on this, that on Wednesday, 14th of February, 2 months after the declaration of Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group, the BAE company agrees price on Typhoon jet deal with Saudi Arabia government, and the British defence firm announces deal on 72 Eurofighters aircraft worth £4.4 billion during Prince Charles' visit to Saudi Arabia, when he wore, mashallah, shimal and thobe, and he showed the respect for their valued customers, you know, and forget all about the human rights in Saudi and the 26,000 prisoners of conscience in Saudi Arabia. Is external pressure can be deniable considering this fact? And what can the Muslim Brotherhood do if they are the victim of this relationship between Britain and Saudi Arabia?
Thank you very much.
Well, it's obvious that Saudi Arabia is an important trading partner of the United Kingdom. That's obvious, and you've highlighted that in your question, particularly in the field of weaponry. The British have sold vast amounts of weaponry to Saudi Arabia over the years, and that's an undeniable fact. I think there is also a feeling in the United Kingdom, and Peter Oborne may give expression to this when he comes later, because he's often written about it, of unease that we have such a close alliance with a government which is so hostile to democracy and rights as the Saudi government appears to be. Now, those two things are obviously in conflict. It's in the nature of the real world, I think, that the commercial interest often outweighs the philosophical interest. I think there's a tension there. I agree with you, there's a significant tension there.
Do you think, Lord Macdonald, can I just follow up from this? Some said when David Cameron announced the review, they said, well, he was just, you know, trying to appear as though he was doing something to appease the trade partners in the Gulf. Do you buy into that?
Well, we are engaging with the review at the moment and providing evidence to the review, and we're doing that in good faith, and we're assembling what we think is a very strong case to demonstrate that the Muslim Brotherhood is a peaceful, constitutional, and, as you have said, Mona, democratic organisation, and that it should be regarded as such by the UK government. And one thing I've learned over more than 30 years as a lawyer, if you don't mind me saying so, is there's not much point attacking your judge before you go into court to plead your case, and I'm not going to do that.
Okay, we'll take another round of questions. By the way, I'm sure that you know who's sitting on my left. I mean, I haven't done the proper introductions. I will do in the second round of this evening, but Dr. Maha Azzam is with us. I'll give her the proper introductions, but I'm pretty sure that you know who she is. And also, as Lord Macdonald said, we're hoping to be joined by the well-known journalist Peter Oborne in due course. So any questions you may direct to any one of the available panelists. I have the gentleman, Dr. Said, would you like to? No? Yeah, okay, so I will come to you, and also the gentleman here at the front, and Dr. Bari. That's the second round of questions. So the microphone to Dr. Said.
Thank you very much. How much has left of the Arab Spring, having the military coup in Egypt, and of course the displacement of al-Nahda from power in Tunisia, and of course what we see in Libya, the attempted coup? How much the Saudis are playing behind the scene or overtly to bring down or to prevent any change in the despotic world of the governance in the Middle East?
Mona, do you want to say something here?
Thank you. If I may attempt at answering the question, there's a very important player that no one could deny in 2011. And this very important player are the youth on the streets and the young Egyptians who had hope. People in Egypt, as I was growing up, people were telling us it's Mubarak, and then Mubarak's son, and then it's going to be a monarchy again. And we could bring it down. So I think there's a very, very important player, and that's something I actually missed on my speech. In Egypt, still there's a huge support of Morsi and the Brotherhood. There's a Pew report that came in last week that says Morsi still has more than 40% support in Egypt. So whatever the Saudis do, whatever anyone tries to do, particularly in Egypt, I think is not important as much as that the Egyptians, the young Egyptians, are coming together and reconciling and forming a new reality. And this new reality will never take another dictatorship again. Thank you.
Just on this particular point, there's something, I often say it's not academic, not in the kind of vein that I often operate, but it's said that you could keep someone in chains and enslave them in a dark cell for decades, for 50 years if you wish. But once they see the light, it's impossible to enslave them for any longer beyond that. It's the fact is that the people of the whole region, not just in Egypt, but we're talking about the entire region, even Saudi Arabia, by the way, the places that were untouched as dramatically as the various other countries where we saw regimes fall. The kind of enthusiasm, the kind of rhetoric that is now dominant throughout the streets is quite tangible. I frequent a particular Arab capital, which I won't name because I still need to go there, and it wasn't one of those capitals. It wasn't Cairo or Tunisia or Benghazi, but let me tell you that wherever I go, in the discussions, whether it be from the airport with between the ordinary people, travelers, and the security officers, to the streets, it's a different tone. It's a totally different tone from how it was 2 or 3 years ago. And therefore I take on what Mona has said, that there is a spirit now. And these bumps, these ups and downs, they may be just part of the process. The second question, the gentleman here. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Khalid, the Citation in this forum. Why do you think there's such a severe disconnect between Western governments and the Muslim Brotherhood? And the investigation which is going to be done by the British government, it seems to be that it's looking at the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat, that this report is going to be a threat assessment. So, that's the way it looks like it's starting from page 1. But, how is the Muslim Brotherhood going to bridge that gap with Western government? Because there's a big, immense gulf between you and the Western government. You need the Western government's support or some understanding.
Thank you for the question. So first of all, it's not an investigation, it's just a review. And governments are entitled to do their reviews, and we engage with them. And we have been engaging with the British government since the revolution. Before Mubarak stepped down, the Brotherhood was outlawed in Egypt. We weren't allowed to function normally. As soon as the revolution happened in 2011, we formed a political party and we started sending delegations. One of the very first countries we actually sent a delegation to was the UK as the Freedom and Justice Party, and we engaged. And even a few weeks before the coup, there was the spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood has had lunch with the British Prime Minister at Chequers, which he has agreed to. And also the President of Egypt, Mr. Morsi, was supposed to be in the UK a few days. Has the coup not happened mid-July? So we have been trying to engage as much as we can, and we believe that the British government and the UK is a democracy and has respect for human rights and rule of law, and they're not going to disregard the facts that we're going to provide them.
Would you like to say anything?
I think this review, the announcement of this review, came out of the blue. And I think it was a surprise to many people, and there was a good deal of consternation when it was announced in the press, certainly in Parliament, and I think in the Foreign Office. And I think there was a bit of consternation about where this had come from, why it was being done, and what its purpose is. And that's why all sorts of theories have been floated about Saudi Arabia, about this, about that, and about the other. One thing that's clear is the government seems very keen to stress that this is not an investigation. So it's not saying that the Muslim Brotherhood has been up to something and we're going to investigate it. It's a review of current government policy. And we're approaching it in that way, which is to address the team on the basis they are not conducting an inquiry, but they are reviewing current policy, and we want to help them to do that. We want to help them to do that by supplying as much information as we can about the Brotherhood, about its recent history, about its role in politics in Egypt, and about its proposals for the future. So I think the truth is that the calling of this review was a bit of a mystery. I think it remains such. I don't think it's entirely clear where it came from. I mean, I can put forward all sorts of theories, but I don't think that would be terribly helpful at this stage. I think that our job is to approach it professionally, with strong evidence, not to call into question its good faith, not to call into question the motives of the people who are conducting it, but to take it at face value, and as Mona says, to respond to it without fear. Muslim Brotherhood, but to take it at face value. It has an entirely respectable history of involvement in democratic politics, and it is, and the Freedom and Justice Party is the victim here. This is the democratically elected government that was ousted in a military coup. And I started my few remarks earlier by pointing that out. It doesn't need pointing out in one sense. In another sense, it doesn't bear repeating too often. This is a democratically elected government that was removed by military action within 12 months of its election. That's the context for this review, and we aim to ensure that those conducting the review don't lose sight of that fact.
Thank you. Here.
Mohammed Bahari. My question has been preemptively responded by Lord Macdonald, but I want to ask in a different way. Britain has a historic and deep knowledge about Egypt and, of course, Brotherhood. So does that mean...
Sorry, who does?
Britain definitely has a deep and historic knowledge about Egypt itself and Brotherhood itself, because Britain has been an empire state. Does that mean that Britain is losing its intellectual edge?
That's a very good question. I think the reality is that you're probably right. I mean, there must be all sorts of sources of information about the Muslim Brotherhood available to the British government in the Foreign Office and elsewhere, and I'm sure that that information will be available to the review team as well. I don't think Britain's losing its intellectual edge. I think we're engaged in a slightly strange process here, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to engage with it fully, and we're satisfied. I'm working closely with Tyre Valley, sitting here in the front row. He's a a London-based lawyer. We're absolutely sure that the right thing to do here is not to ignore this review or to pretend that it's not happening or to simply to dismiss it as being a kangaroo court, which I don't think it is, but to engage with it. And that's what we're doing.
Okay, the third round of questions, I'm going to start with the gentleman there, the lady there in the middle, and then I'm going to take the gentleman at the back. I'm just trying to spread them out, so I will come back to you. Yes.
Carl Arundel from Islington. Lord Macdonald, just to explore a bit further this line that we're currently on. I recall all the headlines and papers talking about a review of the possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood had been involved in inciting violent extremism on British shores. And to paint this as just a review about sort of a strategy, I wonder if that's in conflict with the headlines, the sensational headlines that initially came out. Secondly, having spoken at length over many weeks with senior Muslim Brotherhood figures, some of whom are in the room with us today, who explained that they've been resident there for over 40 years, that senior Muslim Brotherhood figures travel from all over the world to this country freely, that they are known to be a peaceful, caring and democratic group of people, and that if this was an investigation or a review into Muslim Brotherhood, is it one about the 40 years of transition, or is it those people who've left Egypt since the coup and the revolution, of which there are only two, and I think they're both there as well. So could you also just give some understanding what you think are the possible outcomes of a review? I read Dr Rosemary Hollis of Chatham House writing in The Guardian, suggesting that whatever comes out, whether there's a prescription of the Muslim Brotherhood, that was going to be Cameron shooting himself in the foot, and if he didn't prescribe, it was also going to be shooting himself in the foot. Perhaps you can give some comment on that.
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't worry too much about the headlines. I saw some of the more lurid headlines that followed the announcement of this review. I'm afraid that any, and I'm stating the obvious here, I don't mean to offend anybody, but any review that contains the word Muslim in it is going to excite some British newspapers to excesses of the sort that we saw, I'm afraid, and that's a shameful fact that we may as well acknowledge. So I wouldn't pay attention to the headlines. So far as the scope of the review is concerned, it's certainly true that the review team would like to have some understanding of the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, going back to its founding days, and they've had contact with some academics, and I think we're satisfied some highly reputable academics in order to help them understand the early days of the Muslim Brotherhood and its development as an organisation. But they're clearly particularly interested in more recent events. I'm aware of no evidence whatsoever that the Muslim Brotherhood has been involved in fomenting anything remotely like acts of terrorism in the United Kingdom. There is no such evidence that I'm aware of, and I would be very surprised if any existed. But it's true to say that the review team, I think, will be particularly interested in the recent history of the Muslim Brotherhood and indeed in its response to the coup in Egypt and its plans and proposals for the future.
The lady in the middle of the hall, the mic's coming to you. Yes, I'll come back to you next round.
Hi, this is Sarah Silvestri from City University London. I wanted to go back to the Egyptian scenario, maybe have some answers from Mona and from Maha. Suppose we end up at some point with the ideal scenario where the Muslim Brotherhood is decriminalized and the review here passes fine and everybody's happy about the Muslim Brotherhood, and in Egypt there is some way to maneuver and to re-enter the political sphere. How far do you think the Muslim Brotherhood will need to be prepared this time round to compromise with other political actors in order to be regarded as sufficiently acceptable by the international community as a democratic actor?
Do you want to speak on this?
Yes. I think I'd be careful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd be careful to use the word criminalised, because this is a review. It is a review into the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology, policies and so on. So I don't think there is an issue here of criminalizing the group. No, but I just want to come to that because this is important, because this is how this review is being presented in Egypt and in the Middle East region and in the Gulf states. There is a strong interest for the governments that have named the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, namely some of the Gulf countries and Egypt, to not to see this as a review, but to put it in these stark terms that this is an attempt by the UK government to criminalise the Muslim Brotherhood, and I believe that is not the intention of the British government. And if we like the review or dislike the review, like Lord Macdonald, I think we should not question the fairness of how this review will proceed. We may not be happy with some of the procedures, but I think the Muslim Brotherhood themselves are willing to engage with it, and they have nothing to hide. I think on the other matter of the Brotherhood engaging with other forces, this has been part and parcel of what they're about. They were engaged in democratic politics and electoral politics, and that was very much knowing that there are other parties out there with which they compete. There has always been the argument by their detractors and opponents that during the year in which Dr Morsi was elected, that they were not inclusive enough. There are arguments on both sides. Certainly the Brotherhood themselves, or the FJP more accurately, will say that yes, mistakes were made, perhaps there should have been greater attempts at inclusion, but many attempts were also made. So I think both sides of the political spectrum have a lot to answer for. Both those on the Islamist side of the political spectrum, the secularists, the leftists, the liberals, all of them need to now understand that Egypt is threatened by a military dictatorship, and they need to close ranks and come together in a broad coalition. I think there are moves towards that, and Egypt is not unlike other countries that have struggled and have tried to seek either their independence from a colonizing power or seek a democratic path against dictatorship. In all those instances, different political forces need to make concessions and to form a broad coalition in order to bring down either a dictatorship or to fight those that inhibit their freedoms. And Egypt is at a stage that is no different.
Thank you. The gentleman over there. Yes?
David Page. I think it's an opportunity to review, simply because we don't have such things into OCs and domestic political groups. So I think you've got a great opportunity. I too am puzzled as to why it's happened. I think there's an element possibly of other governments in Europe who are anxious over the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think you're making a mistake to concentrate too much on Egypt. It is a British government review of its policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood. I was in another place before the coup where a Saudi diplomat described the Arab Spring as the Arab winter. And I think you'd also might be foolish in view of the Foreign Office's track record of the last certainly 10, maybe 15 years, to believe they are the fountain of all wisdom, because they are not. We have gone into 2 wars for somewhat mixed reasons. We've supported one war in Libya and then said a war in Syria is not to be supported. But I think a couple of words have come up, and I noted them. One is fear. One is appeasement, which I must admit I didn't expect to hear again. Trade and ethics, which make the acronym FATE. You are very lucky to have your fate about to be looked at. But I do think you may think that this is a very insular government thing. I don't come from London, as you may have detected from my accent. But outside London, the Muslim Brotherhood has almost no footprint. It is unknown to people. And the United Kingdom is not London. And I think that's a point that should be made, because we are looking at a political ideology looking forward, not back. And the Arab Spring may have become the Arab winter, but it is unlikely to have been completely extinguished I exclude Egypt for the moment. And I think the United Kingdom has got to look forward to what may happen within the Middle East and North Africa, and not just Egypt. I think you're making a big mistake by focusing just on Egypt.
Well, I'm not sure that the review is focusing just on Egypt, but we are, because that's the area that we're asked to address. It's beyond our resources to assemble material from around the world for these purposes, and we're particularly concerned to ensure the review is fully briefed on the election's aftermath. I certainly agree with you that the Foreign Office is not the fount of all wisdom, and that's been shown not just in recent history, but in less recent history too. And I also agree with you that I think the British government would be very well advised to look forward a little here, and not just to make decisions based on the world as it is now. It's an important part of statecraft, it seems to me, to have some sort of imagination about where the world might be in the future. Someone's already said it's not so long since a senior member of the Muslim Brotherhood was eating supper with David Cameron in Chequers. And who's to say that won't happen again? So the government needs to be imaginative when it's considering these sorts of issues. The revolutions happen overnight. They just happen. I don't think a single Western intelligence agency predicted the Arab Spring. These things happen, the world changes, and suddenly we're all asking ourselves why it didn't happen before and how we didn't see it coming. And so the situation in Egypt can change again overnight. The situation in Saudi Arabia could change overnight. And I think the government will be well advised to be exercising a bit of imagination about what might happen in parts of the world which presently don't have governments with popular mandates, and how those parts of the world would look if they did have governments with popular mandates.
Just before I come to the third round, if I may, just on this particular point, Dave, our interest as the Cordoba Foundation holding this particular event, whilst we take Egypt, I'll be honest with you, we're taking it as a case study. Because what concerns us most, and our researchers around the hall today are taking notes quite fervently, they're doing so because the case that we're interested about is the response of the British government, as well as the European governments, to such changes that happen in areas as sensitive as the Middle East. The reaction to the emergence, politically as well as socially and economically, of ideas that are so different to ourselves, the predominant ideology or framework of thought here in the UK. That, to be honest, is our declared interest. However, I don't think that we can escape the fact that we are today, when we do talk about political Islam, when we do talk about Islamism, when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, that the case of Egypt is quite apt. It is quite prominent. I mean, for instance, someone, I believe Dr. Saeed asked about or suggested the case of Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia effectively is, well, still by far and large the party that has the overwhelming popularity and majority is Ennahda, which is part of the Muslim Brotherhood structure network. But no one's talking about that because things are going not well, but relatively, if you take in comparison to Egypt, they're going okay. So no one's talking about that yet. So I think that the case of Egypt, and why we're amplifying the case of Egypt, is for that. But our interest in holding this particular event is to try to understand, to analyse, and to try to shed some light and commentary on the British government as well as the British establishment in terms of the media and the overriding narrative of how we address certain changes that bring us to confront peers or counterparts of such different and totally opposed, diametrically opposed sometimes, frameworks of thought and ideas. So that's our interest base. But let me come to a very brief final session of questions. I have the gentleman here, the lady here, and I'm going to take the lady in the second row, if I may. And then, by the way, we're going to have a second part with Dr. Maha, and hopefully Peter Oborne will join us, and then we'll come back to several other rounds of questioning. So bear with us. Yes?
So, just to respect the right of the British government to review the Muslim Brotherhood and ideology and stuff like this. All of us, we see who's killing who. Muslim Brotherhood or the support of Muslim Brotherhood, there are people now in the prison of Egypt. Some figures say 41,000 in the prison now. Over 6,000 to 7,000 people been killed since the coup. People been tortured, students, people in the state, child, young people, everywhere. What I'm trying to say here, is it right for the British government to do review for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, from my view, is innocent? What about the current Egyptian government, which is the one who killing the Egyptian people, the one who destroyed democracy in Egypt, the one who destroyed everywhere in Egypt by the name of the killing or fight of terrorists? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that since it seized power, the present Egyptian regime has been guilty of crime on a very wide and profound scale. Crimes against international law, crimes against humanity, and the sorts of crimes that are within the jurisdiction of international criminal courts. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And you're right, that is to be contrasted with the behaviour of the Muslim Brotherhood and their response to the Sisi regime. And I hope that that's a contrast, as I've said a couple of times now, which the review will take careful note of.
So, just to
very briefly, if I may.
Why we don't call as a group for the British government to do review about the CC group and the British government?
Okay.
Well, that's not a question.
Yeah, I mean, that's at this moment of time we're addressing what's happening right now. That may be a step that we may collectively decide to adopt in future days. But if I may, the lady, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Assalamu alaikum. We're representatives of Israel in the UK, being involved in the UK review to assist in peaceful negotiations. Will Muslim Brotherhood also work with Israeli representatives for peace in the region?
Yeah, do you want to say something?
Thank you for the question. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party, the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, has engaged in the peace process in the region. It did not. The Muslim Brotherhood upheld all the treaties and all the previous accords that Egypt has had from before. It actually, the Muslim Brotherhood also and the Freedom and Justice Party, under the leadership of President Morsi, they brokered the ceasefire between Gaza and Israel in November 2012. And Egypt and the Egyptian government played a very important role to maintain the peace in the region for the benefit of the entire region. So the Muslim Brotherhood engages with everyone and anyone to maintain the peace and the stability of the region.
Thank you. The lady, yes?
My name is Sue Willman. I'm a solicitor at Dyson Pierce Glynn. My question is, are my clients, my Muslim clients, wrong to fear the review as part of a wider intrusion on their human rights and civil liberties? Just a week or two after the review was announced, I received a call from a client who was an ex-member of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. His house had been raided. He had to spend 2 nights in a hotel with his wife and kids, and they still haven't had their computer returned to them. That was followed by a number of calls from other families, all of whom had had their houses raided under the Anti-Terrorism Act. And the thing that they all had in common is that they were all Middle Eastern with a history of political activism, Islamic activism. So I just ask, should there be further concerns about what's going to happen next, taking that background into account?
Well, the answer is I don't know. I'm not aware of any links between the review and the activities that you described. I don't know.
I mean, that may be a subject for another discussion, and that is the conflation of so many things all under one element. I mean, one of the questions that was suggested to us as a theme was the tying in times of time, as well as the rhetoric of the review into the Muslim Brotherhood that we're discussing tonight, and the introduction of certain policies and approaches security-wise regarding the relationship with Syria and those traveling to Syria. The timing was seen as conspicuous, and the narrative was seen as being conflating the issues, and therefore people, in a sense, muddying the waters so that the lines are blurred. But that may be for another day. But thank you very much for the questions. I'm going to call a close for the first session of audience participation and engagement. I'm going to move to the second part of this evening. On my left, I have the immense pleasure of having Dr. Maha Azzam, a great friend, someone whom I'm extremely privileged and honored to be working with closely on this and various other issues. She's a prominent academic specializing in political Islam, Islam and globalization, Middle East politics, and Islamist groups in the Middle East, with particular reference to Egypt. She is the chair of Egyptians for Democracy UK and deputy head for the International Coalition for Egyptians Abroad. Also, she's a founding member of the Brussels Declaration, an initiative to establish a broad coalition of Egyptians against the military regime. So without further ado, Dr. Maha Azzam.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here, and we are covering a subject that really engages us well beyond the UK. And I'll try to explain why. In order to understand what the Muslim Brotherhood are about, we need to remember, as has been said before, that they have been the most important, most significant, most widespread social and political movement in Muslim majority countries, in a vast number of Muslim majority countries, particularly in the Middle East, throughout the 20th and 21st century. That tells you something just about the breadth and the importance of this group. This group is intrinsically connected to society. Attempts recently by dictators, particularly in Egypt, but this has been ongoing for decades, to claim that the Brotherhood are somehow separate from society, somehow an alien force, an outside force that is not connected and not, in some ways, not indigenous in the broadest sense to their communities and to their societies and to their nations, is part of the attack of dictatorship on them. Just in sheer numbers and in terms of the values they espouse, they are part and parcel of the history and the very makeup of their societies. They represent a movement that has stood against autocracy and repression for decades, when others acquiesced and gave in. They remain the strongest voice, among others, but the strongest in terms of numbers, for freedom and electoral politics in the Middle East. And that is why the connection and an understanding of them in relation to the Middle East is so important. Because if we look at the slate, the recent one, without even going back into history, too far into history, and see how they've behaved in terms of their relationship with dictatorship, and then when there are the opportunities open to them for participation in parliamentary politics, how they behave. Under the dictatorships of the 1970s in Egypt, under Nasser, then Sadat, then Mubarak, they were oppressed. When there was a degree of political opening up, they engaged as either independents or, when possible, otherwise in electoral politics and in parliaments. Many of them are parliamentarians. When the Arab Spring came, they were engaged in the revolution. They played a pivotal role in the success of that revolution. And they went on, after the fall of Mubarak, to be at the forefront of political opening up, establishing a political party, the Freedom and Justice Party, participating in free and fair elections, playing by the rules of the game. The FJP acted as a democratic political force in Egyptian politics throughout the period post-2011. The Muslim Brotherhood and its political party, the FJP, came out on top every time Egyptians were asked to vote. The Egyptians went to the polls post-2011 5 times, whether to vote for a constitution, in referendums and parliamentary elections, and in the presidential election that brought President Dr. Muhammad was as president. In all those, the Egyptian people chose them. Let us not take this opportunity those that don't belong to the FJP and the Brotherhood to the democratic process. Let us say that there were others outside the Brotherhood and the FJP who played democratic process was hindered. I think many now realize the mistake of this, that maybe they didn't like the results of the polls, but they should have stuck with the democratic process. Because what happened thereafter was the comeback of the military. A military that has managed to maintain the underdevelopment of a country like Egypt for 60 years, that has maintained itself in power through repressive means, a repression that has increased in the last year, almost 1 year now, since the coup of July the 3rd, a level of repression unknown to Egypt, massacres that human rights organizations have described as the worst in the modern history of Egypt. How did the Brotherhood react to such massacres? We know that during the democratic opening up, they played by the rules of the game, and they formed a political party, they believed in democracy, they upheld democratic values, they were attacked by the outside world and sometimes from within Egypt for not being inclusive enough. They admit to certain mistakes, but they didn't override the democratic process in order to bring it down. But how did they react post the coup when they were being repressed? As a group, when they were being massacred in Rabaa and Nakhda and elsewhere in Egypt. Did they take up arms? Or was the policy of their organization and of their leadership to remain peaceful? Since July, the Brotherhood and its supporters and the broad coalition of forces with them in the alliance in Egypt have come out almost daily in peaceful protests, insisting on their peacefulness. At the core of their resistance is non-violence, and their call is for a return to democracy. So what we have to look at is the behavior of a particular political and social group, how it behaves when the political process is opened up to them, and how they even behave under excessive repressive measures. In both situations, they are remaining non-violent and upholding their struggle for democracy and the return of democracy in Egypt. Now, that threatens many in the region. And there is a connectivity. We can't necessarily prove it, but we know that from the beginning, regional governments, not societies, but regional governments and regimes felt threatened by the equation of Islam plus democracy. They felt it was the greatest threat to them because it may affect their own societies who want greater accountability, greater participation, greater transparency, and anti-corruption. All the things that the Brotherhood uphold and have always upheld. Those are the components of a new and more developed Middle East, not an old Middle East. Those are the values that the young want to see enshrined in their societies. Ultimately, the Brotherhood in power under Dr. Morsi in 2012 did not seek to export their values or their revolution. One of the first visits Dr. Morsi made, if not the first, I believe, was to Saudi Arabia. There are those in Egypt who attacked him for this. But ultimately, he was not intending or did not want to export anything. He was concerned, like his supporters, with the economic development of Egypt and the removal over time through reform of corruption in that country. And I insist on the word corruption, because Egypt is a country that sits at, I think, 114 out of 177 states on the corruption index list. Egypt's institutions are corrupt. Its judiciary, as has been proven by the verdicts that were declared against over 1,000 people calling for their execution. A judiciary that ensured that Egypt's first freely elected parliament was dissolved. A judiciary that stood by those that carried out the coup. Its security services, its police force, its media. Those are the institutions of the state that have existed for 60 years and are decaying. And it's those decayed institutions that stood against the first freely elected government of Egypt. And those are the institutions today against which the Muslim Brotherhood, not on its own, but with many other Egyptians, as we've seen lately with the refusal of Egyptians to go and vote, with probably the vast majority of Egyptians. The kind of institutions that exist in Egypt today are in need of serious reform. And I put it to you that the rise of the Brotherhood through free and fair elections created fear in all those who didn't want to see reform in Egypt or elsewhere in the region. So it wasn't Dr. Morsi's or his supporters' Islamist politics, because really that year didn't see any Islamist politics. That year was a year about trying to build democracy and weed out corruption. That any reformist who had come to power, I believe, in Egypt, Islamist or leftist or liberal, would have seen a coup or the coup conspirators work against him. Egypt is not unlike other countries, whether they be Chile under Allende, and then we saw the coming to power of Pinochet, or Mossadegh in Iran in the 50s. Democratically elected leaders or reformists face a great deal of challenge and ultimately fail because the institutions of the state and the military are often against them, and sometimes outside forces as well. In the case of Egypt, the challenge to all democrats, not only the Muslim Brotherhood, comes from an old corrupt elite in Egypt, decaying institutions, but also regional powers that don't want to see democracy in their own countries. Let me try to wrap up by looking just outside the region, and the UK in particular. There does need to be a review of UK foreign policy towards the region, and particularly towards Egypt. The UK, like the European Union, has often spoken of the need for good governance in our part of the world, and for respect for human rights. Their position now vis-à-vis Egypt and many countries of the region contradicts their very values and the principles enshrined in human rights charters and the United Nations Human Rights Charter, and the very principles and values of the EU and of this country. The whole idea that somehow there are interests and there are values and that these are separate, I think now really needs to be rethought and reanalyzed. The balance of power changed with the Arab Spring, and the UK came round to backing the Arab Spring and the search for democracy and the beginnings of the democratic process in that part of the world. It shifted its position because it felt that the balance of power shifted. And as one is often told, the UK government deals with governments. It can certainly deal with governments, but it depends how it can deal with them in different ways. It doesn't have to normalize relations with governments that abuse human rights to this level. And also the whole issue of interests needs to be thought out clearly. There is a connectivity between values and interests, and I believe the British public want to see a foreign policy that is value-ridden as well, that is based on respect for human rights for others and respect for the rule of law. Ultimately, what the US, the UK, and the EU in general fear is the issue of stability. Stability and security, we are told, are at the heart of their foreign policy decisions. So in the case of Egypt, for example, they want security of the Suez Canal, they want the continuation of the peace process with Israel, they want to ensure that their investments are safe. All these areas are not ones that were threatened under a Muslim Brotherhood government, nor would they be under any elected government made up of the FJP or others. This is not the concern. The main concern of the FJP and the Brotherhood is stability and moderation. It is not about upsetting the political and economic order. They are ultimately reformists and democrats. If they were not, they would have, when they took the reins of power in Egypt, have opted for a revolutionary route that would have upset the status quo quite dramatically. What they hope to do is gradually reform society and gradually also ensure that the military was out of power and that this may be done over time. What we have now is a crisis in civil-military relations. We have a security and stability crisis in Egypt with a low-level insurgency. We have a threat to the whole nation because of a polarization that came about because of a narrative of a military, like all other militaries historically and all fascist regimes, that can only survive by dividing society and creating a rhetoric and a narrative of hate. Where we are now and how we can move forward is for the UK and democratic societies the world over to realize that ultimately this is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, not between democracy and the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamist forces. The main challenge is to fight authoritarianism and the return of authoritarianism in Egypt. It is symbolic, but it is important. Because unless it is defeated in Egypt, the message that's being sent out to all fragile democracies, and we've seen this recently in Thailand, and it will happen again and again, is that the strong man or the military can enter politics and upset the democratic process. This is an opportunity today. We have seen in Egypt people refusing to come out and vote. This is tantamount to civil disobedience by Egyptians to say, no, we will not return to military dictatorship. We may not want the Brotherhood, we may want the Brotherhood. The choice belongs to the Egyptian people. But ultimately governments, like the UK and others, can stand by those looking for democracy in their countries and send a clear signal to those that spoke of a roadmap to democracy, saying you have neither legitimacy from your people who have refused to vote for you, and you do not have legitimacy from the international community that refuses to support systems that abuse the human rights of their people, repress them and have killed thousands, and are accused of crimes against humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maha. Peter Oborne is just around the corner, and he's arriving imminently. I'd like at this stage to announce that Lord Macdonald has to leave. He has an engagement that he has to attend, and therefore he has to leave. And therefore I wish on everyone's behalf to extend to him our thanks and gratitude for his contribution to us today. Thank you very much. Thank you. And just taking on from what Dr. Maha Azzam just said so eloquently and so beautifully, I think what we're trying to address here are a number of questions. The question about, you know, for decades, as long as I am aware and I recall, the question about the compatibility between Islam and democracy, or political Islam and democracy, has always been cited. I think that that question needs to be put to bed. And I think that the question that we really need to ask, and we seriously need to pursue an answer for, is whether Western democracies are comfortable with the outcome of democratic processes in the Arab and Muslim world, regardless of what those outcomes bring, regardless of whoever wins those democratic elections. I think that that is the question that we need to start asking. Because the messages that are being sent, and you know, one thing that we wanted to discuss tonight was a ramification of the review. Now, whilst Lord Macdonald and everyone here on the panel today said that we are and we will be dealing with the review in good faith, and that is absolutely true, but at the same time, the ramifications and implications, the messages being sent by the announcement of the review and by the shape and format of the review are quite significant and quite serious. Because what's happened is essentially a government whom proclaims and announces and is proud to uphold freedoms and democracy and democratic values, actually looking into the ideology of a victim of a military coup. A victim who acted perfectly within the democratic rules of the game. But that victim is now the subject of this particular review. That's a message being sent. The other message is that essentially, and by the way, one of the things that the Cordoba Foundation, as well as many organizations, some of which are present here in the hall today, have been doing for decades now, is addressing young Muslims and urging them towards expressing themselves and expressing their desires and their aspirations through the political process. Engaging politically. That's the way to reform. That's the way to change. Such stands in terms of what's happening in Egypt. The announcement of a review in the shape that it's taking place right now sends a message that, you know, that urgency for political engagement is not really appropriate. Doesn't really work. Politics doesn't really work. Essentially, the ideological battle that was fought within the Muslim community over the past 20 years, and I would happily declare has been won by those here in the hall, was against those who said there is no hope in engaging with societies because they believe in a different faith, or because they adopt a different lifestyle, or because they have a different set of values or the such. That was the battle that was fought within the Muslim community over the past 20 years, and I'm glad to report that that battle was largely won. And we see now that the national averages of Muslims taking place in every round of elections, local, parliamentarian, European, often is greater than the national average across the board in the UK. But the thing is that such stands regarding Egypt, sort of giving tacit report to a military coup against a democratically elected government, sends a message that actually it's the others who have it right. Politics doesn't really work, because it's a different set of values, it's a different set of ideas, and that is extremely dangerous. We need to understand exactly what are the rules of the game here. What are the rules of engagement? Are we to lead young Muslims today to actually believe and commit themselves to political engagement? Or are they to be sent a very firm and clear message that you can engage all you want, but ultimately, if the outcome doesn't suit us, then we're not going to adopt it? And by the way, it's not just Egypt that we're looking at. We are now looking at several examples that those who are against political engagement are now citing, throwing in our faces if you wish. From back to 1991, with the Algerian elections, and what's happened then. The first rounds of elections, which were won by a majority, a landslide in fact, by the Islamic Front party, and then the tanks hit the streets, and then we had 2 decades in the life of a nation the size and the magnitude of Algeria, so horrific, that claimed the lives of over 1 million civilians as a result of that stand whereby we helped to scupper probably the very first free and fair democratic elections in that region of the world. Followed in 2006 with the elections in Palestine, again free and fair. And when the Palestinian people chose Hamas as their government, they were then, unceremoniously punished, collectively punished, until now, as a result of their choice back in 2006. And now with what has taken place in Egypt. So time after time after time, every single time, Islamists or political Islamic parties, they prove themselves worthy players and often worthy winners. And yet every single time, the West, democratic countries, adopt a particular stand that undermines those particular experiences. And therefore, coming back to the question by Dr. Saeed about the Arab Spring, the Arab Spring in 2011 was the perfect antithesis to the ideology of al-Qaeda, to the nihilist ideology of al-Qaeda. Because forever, that ideology was based on the premise that you cannot achieve radical, total transformation without the use of violence and arms. Through the Arab Spring and what's happened in Tunisia and Egypt particularly, what we saw was that particular thesis was put to bed, was proven wrong. And therefore now the reversal of the Arab Spring is to prove the ideology of al-Qaeda correct and right. And therefore the danger for all of us here in Britain, in London, is immense. And that's something that I think we must bear in mind is a discussion that is taking place up and down the country, and not just in the UK, but further afield. I will, at this particular point, like to mention a few things. In your packs, there is a couple of papers that I'd like to point out. One is an open letter signed by several dozen of luminaries across British society. I wish I didn't say that word because I'm one of them. But and this was published in today's Guardian. I think it was page 16. You have in your pack a copy of the letter. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that I'm not sure whether it's in your pack, but it's definitely at the registration desk on your way out. There is a sheet with several points regarding the review, which you can write in with. Those are the main points, certain elements that might be worthy of taking into consideration when contacting the review committee. So on your way out, at the registration desk, please pick up one of those sheets. Now, again, I've been told that Peter is entering the building, and I'm pretty sure that he'd be proud of being announced in the same vein as Elvis. However, what I will do in the next few minutes, I'll take a round of questions. We have Muna and we have Dr. Maha, and I'd like to open. I see some hands that were raised, and so I'll open questions for about 5-10 minutes until Peter arrives and settles in, and then we'll have him to round up tonight's event. So I have two gentlemen here in the middle, the lady here in the front, and the gentleman there at the back. So can I have the microphone to the two gentlemen sitting there?
Ibrahim Halawi, PhD student, Royal Colvin. I have two short questions. The first is, before the coup actually occurred, there were millions of Egyptian people in the streets. So how do you explain that? Because I think probably the Muslim Brotherhood in Britain, they have nothing against the British government. So I think the review would get to a point where your facts would prove what you're saying. But I think this is being used to romanticize the period of Morsi and power, whereby there was a lot of mistakes, there was attempts to Islamize the institutions of the country, and there was a lot of democratic mistakes as well in the practice and the process. So I think this is being used to justify and kind of undermine that millions of people took the streets, but the coup actually happened. Another question is Britain's foreign policy trying to, or struggling to balance out between a new geopolitical contest between Saudi Arabia and Qatar? Because it's true that there was a huge contracts of armed contracts with Saudi Arabia, but as well, London would not be light up tonight if it wasn't for the al-Qazzaz and also other main investments in London. So these are the two questions. Thank you.
Mona, do you want to take that? This way. Yep.
Thank you for the question. Obviously, we're asked this question quite often. There are millions of people who came out on the street. The numbers were huge on June 30th, but I disagree with you, because nothing justifies a military coup in this day and age. Nothing. If there are millions supporting one political agenda over the other, parliamentary elections were coming up, and they would have participated in it. If there are millions, really, why are they not voting nowadays? So I think there has been an exaggeration in the numbers. People were unhappy. Yes, Egypt has suffered decades of corruption. Morsi should have done better. He should have done better. And we all need to work with him to make it work as a democratic process. I'm not saying the Muslim Brotherhood are angels. We're not saying the Freedom and Justice Party the whole year was flawless, but we were willing to engage as a group of people. We were willing to build together and reform Egypt. What happened now is a hijack of the entire process. There's no reform. There's no. So now Egypt is in a worse position than it was during Mubarak's time, in terms of the repression and the human rights violations, and in terms of inclusivity, the hate speech that we as Egyptians want to build together. This is not what we here should be calling for. We should be calling for a pluralistic process in Egypt that will bring people together.
Thank you very much. Do you want to go? Bring it close to you.
Yeah. I'll just add something small to that, and that is there were millions in the street, but factually we know that through statistical evidence later and research, that the numbers were fabricated. We were told by the Egyptian media and this was accepted by many in the West, that the numbers ranged. First we were told 30 million, then we were told 17 million, and they stuck at 17 million, but still the Egyptian media still speaks of 30 million. It's virtually impossible. You may be talking about 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, but nothing more than that. Mona rightly says that, you know, there is an electoral process. Why was there a coup? There are many who went out on the 30th of June and who say today, we went out, but it didn't mean we wanted a military coup. They facilitated a military coup, and they are responsible for that.
Yes.
But at the same time, ultimately, many of them, especially the revolutionary youth and others, did not want a military coup. I think the issue of Islamizing institutions, I think again that is questionable. And perhaps I can be less defensive about these things because I will look at them with an academic hat and say, what Islamization of institutions? It was barely a year. The very fact that the institutions of the state worked against President Morsi in such a fashion ultimately means he didn't succeed in putting enough of his own people in those institutions. There were some changes, but very superficial ones. And they weren't meant to Islamize. They were meant to put people in that would weed out corruption, like any new government that's coming in. And so much of the messaging that we're getting in the narrative is coming from the very opponents of the MB or the opponents of the Morsi government or those that support the old regime or support the military. And that's where we have to be very careful. Who's providing this evidence and this narrative? Let's remember that today in Egypt, how many governments are there? 17? Muhafzat? How many? 27. 27. The 27 governments have military men heading these governments. Since the coup, there's no civilian in sight. We have the return of a military regime. What we had before that is an attempt, one, to push back the military and create a civilian state, and two, to weed out corruption. As I say, the key elements of a democratic process. Thank you.
The gentleman next, yes.
Nabil Robbins, teacher. Someone mentioned Tunisia earlier. I just wanted to make a comment about that, because it's a country that I know very well. First of all, you may or may not know, because it's generally not covered as well in the media as Egypt or other Muslim countries, is that despite Harakat al-Nahda, the Nahda movement winning the largest number of seats in the assembly in Tunisia, they actually decided to give up power in favour of a technocratic government that started to rule a couple of months ago, which in itself shows the democratic impulse that motivates a lot of brotherhood or brotherhood-related parties. So this in itself is something that can be shown to contradict those who claim otherwise. And the other point is that things actually aren't going that well in Tunisia, and that there are worrying signs that what is happening in Egypt could well happen, although it will happen in a much more subtle way, and I think that there won't necessarily be a military coup, but that the Ben Ali state is still there, and that there are worrying signs of journalists being arrested, actors being arrested in the last few weeks, that would seem to suggest that perhaps the head was not cut off the snake, and that eventually there will be a return to authoritarianism, albeit without a military coup.
Thank you very much. I have, hang on, Ian, yes, I'll come to you, Ian. Oh, right, and sorry, can I come to the gentleman, because I gave him the I'll come to the gentleman at the very back. And then I have Ian and Sahar. I'll come back to you in the next batch of questions.
My name is Stephen Bell, and I'm here on behalf of the Stop the War Coalition Officers Group. We thank the Cordoba Foundation for laying on this important seminar and inviting us. We have actually made a contribution to the government's review because we have been privileged to work with supporters and friends of the Muslim Brotherhood since 2001. This has covered such important issues as the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the continuing disbursement and occupation of Palestine, and generally the position of the Muslim community in Britain. Now, these, we must stress, are mainstream issues. These are issues of significance for the country. And the contribution that members and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood have made on these questions over this past decade has been significant in raising the level of political discussion and raising the understanding of hundreds of thousands and even millions of people, thanks to the insight and expertise of members and supporters of the Brotherhood. So we are concerned at any attempt to isolate this most influential trend, not simply in the Middle East, but in this country. An important contribution is being made to the future of our country. So we are concerned, we hope, as has been suggested, that this will be a fair review. But we are concerned that this could be part of a process of the normalisation of relations with the military coup in military dictatorship in Egypt, and the idea that people Muslim in this country shouldn't have an opinion and don't have a contribution to make. Now, hopefully that will not be the case. However, on behalf of the Stop the War Coalition, I would like to stress we are committed to our common endeavour with you in support of peace, democratic rights, social justice and equality between and within nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, I appreciate you being here. I told you that Peter was around the corner, and he's here. I'm pleased to welcome Peter to the panel. Let me find a piece of paper. He is the chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph and reports for Channel 4's Dispatches, An Unreported World. He is the author of The Triumph of the Political Class. He was voted Columnist of the Year at the Press Awards in 2013. Please welcome Peter Oborne.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me here. I apologise for being late. I write my Daily Telegraph political column on Wednesdays, and there's always an argument with the desk at about 6 p.m. That's inevitable. But I came as soon as I could, having had that argument.
And won it, I hope.
Creative discussion. No, they're very. Now, so I apologise for being late. You've invited me to speak about the media and the situation in Egypt. And I want to make a few observations, partly about the situation in Egypt, which we know so well, but also make some comparisons with the public discourse here in Britain and perhaps also in the United States. We can all agree about the outrageous situation that prevails in Egypt at the moment. And the appalling and the way in which the regime is disgracing itself by holding journalists in jail. I think I frequently tried to make the point to the government in Cairo that if Egypt is a great country with a fantastic history and often had a very proud leadership role in the Arab world, but it cannot be to hold journalists in jail is in the way that is being done at the moment, let alone all of these random sentencing to death. This is putting Egypt into the position of a pariah state. And I'm sure that's not what the victor in these elections this week would like. And I think it's doing untold damage to the reputation of Egypt around the world. Not just, and I would like also to say, Western journalists have this focus on the state of Western journalists in Egyptian jails. I'm just as interested, if not more so, in local Egyptian journalists who are being held in Egyptian jails. All journalists held in Egyptian jails should be released. They are my brothers and sisters, and I just think the regime needs to understand that message. I mean, there's many more broader points which we can make, but I think it can't be made too often. But I think one can also move away from the situation in Egypt and just make a few comparisons to the media discourse in this country, which is clearly much more open and more free than what prevails in Cairo. Nevertheless, I've been disturbed by the discourse about the situation in Egypt. Maya was talking about the reporting of the coup d'etat and the acceptance of fabricated figures repeatedly happened by the BBC, for instance, at the height of the problem. And I think that there has been a too great a reluctance to accept too great a readiness to accept the official stories, and too little skepticism. I'm also worried more broadly about the freedom of the ability of Muslims to articulate their concerns in this country. Last autumn, I attended the Global Peace and Unity event in East London, where there was not a single government minister or MP or opposition MP or spokesman, no mainstream politician at all. It was a very odd event because as you walked into the GPU, one was met by representatives from Maha Azzam, telling you that it was a haram, that there was some fun and games and enjoyment going on in this event, and apparently people were having a nice time, and that was bad. But worse still was the fact that it was engaging in democracy, which was obviously regarded very... and yet if democracy was refusing to engage with the GPU. Now, one of the things I've been rather remiss about is trying to find out what the problem which British politicians had. And I think there is a problem about the engagement of mainstream British politicians with mainstream Muslim organisations. I fully accept that there are issues about Maha Azzam being in the public square, al-Qaeda sympathisers and so forth. But for the Muslim Council of Britain to be treated in the way it seems to have been at the GPU, I find very odd indeed. And I don't know the answer why that is going on. But I tend to link this with the... I do think there is potentially... I'm only speculating now. I haven't done any serious research. But it is worth asking the question of whether this extraordinary decision by Mr. David Cameron, whose record on foreign policy is extremely poor. He seems actually not to know what he's talking about quite a lot of the time when it comes to foreign policy. To have this investigation into the Muslim Brotherhood, put Mr. Jenkins, Sir John Jenkins, I think he may now be, who I know quite well. He's a perfectly sensible Foreign Office careerist and quite a distinguished man in his way. But, you know, to put the man our man in Riyadh in charge of this, I mean, he's ludicrous. And it clearly comes from a pressure from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf states, who are afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood for political reasons. In other words, it represents a democratic movement, a democratic form of Islam as against the autocratic. I mean, we can go on about Saudi Arabia forever, but the kind of repression and autocracy which we see in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, it's clearly the Muslim Brotherhood is a threat to the Saudi, and for the British government to give in to pressure from Saudi Arabia to carry out this investigation is a complete disgrace, and shows, I think, an ineptitude and a failure of Prime Minister Cameron, the Prime Minister, to understand foreign policy and how it works and what actually why he is carrying out the actions which he does. He's, at the very least, the very best for the Prime Minister, he's taking extremely bad advice. And I do think there is a connection, therefore, which we ought to establish between the grotesque crackdown on journalism and free speech in Egypt and the treatment of the Muslim organizations in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, it's getting late and I know that you're getting tired, so we will round up with another session of questions. I had from before, I had Ian and Sahar. If I can have another one hand that shoots up to start off the first round of questions. I don't, so I'll start with, well, I have the gentleman here. So I'll start with Ian, please.
Ian back from The Guardian. I really want to ask a fundamental question. I understand the objections as set out in the open letter published in my paper today. But I wonder, what is it you fear in terms of a likely outcome of this? Because it seems to me, and I think a lot of people would agree, and some of it has come out in the discussion, that there's not likely to be much of an outcome. I don't think anybody imagines for a moment that it's a review, not an investigation, as everybody keeps saying. I think it is unthinkable that there would be any measures taken against the Muslim Brotherhood in this country. I think it's clear that the pressure that is in the background from the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, to do bad things to the Muslim Brotherhood will be there. But I think it will be resisted. I don't believe that the British government is going to accept the kind of nonsense that you hear from those countries about the Muslim Brotherhood. So what is actually going to come out of this? That's what I'd like to hear, something to explain.
Thank you very much. Maha.
Yes. Like you, I have faith in the British government. Despite all that we are saying about the dangers of the review. But let me say this. The very fact that a review was called for at a time when the Brotherhood had engaged in democratic politics, had been the victims and continue to be the victims of repression, and for the focus to be on them rather than on the repressive regime in Egypt, in itself is a dangerous message. Because by reviewing them and putting the onus or putting the spotlight on them at this particular juncture, where they are being oppressed in Egypt, as are other Egyptians, it is the reading of this review also in the region that matters, and the message that the UK government is giving about itself, about its foreign policy, about its association with governments such as Saudi Arabia and others that are dangerous. Because anything that comes out of that review, even if it isn't really that bad, it's a questioning of certain areas that look a bit grey, or a questioning of certain positions that maybe some members of the Brotherhood have taken, if not the whole organization, creates a degree of suspicion about the group in the eyes of those that know very little about it. And that means the UK public at large, others in Europe, and gives, in a sense, ammunition, even though it may not be the full ammunition that those governments that are opposed to the Brotherhood in the region want. And it is exactly the timing and the lack of really any real reason, as far as we know, to pursue a review at this juncture. Particularly, as I say, that, as I've said in my presentation, the facts are there. The Brotherhood has played by the rules of the game. It isn't connected to violence. And trying to find out about its principles and ideology and to know more about it could have happened through engagement and so on without an official review. So I think ultimately there is more of a downside to having this review in terms of even the notion of the national security interests of this country, because it antagonizes the community more broadly, and it creates among those who know very little about the Brotherhood within the community, who tend to discriminate against anything Islamic or other. It gives them greater ammunition and aids that kind of suspicion and undermines community harmony at a time when we need it most.
Thank you. Mona, would you like to say something here?
So, as I mentioned during my presentation, as the Muslim Brotherhood, we have nothing to hide and we have nothing to fear. So thank you, Maha, for clarifying that. And we have, because of that, we have engaged with the review committee, and we're willing to engage with whoever wants to engage with us. Because we are engaging with the democratic process in Egypt and elsewhere. This is inherent in our ideology. We have an eminent legal team that is supporting our case. It's a legal team to make sure that no irregularities are going to happen during the review. So we are fully engaging with the review committee. So would you like to say something?
Tayyib, you want to say something here? Do you want to? Then I'll come to Peter.
I think it's important. Sorry, I'm Tayyib Ali. I'm the lawyer leading the legal team along with Lord Ken Macdonald in respect of the UK review and other legal action that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party have taken in the United Kingdom and around the world. What I'd like to say about the UK review is very, very short, is that there is nothing to fear from the review if the review is done fairly and properly. I am slightly concerned about the length of time that we have to explain to the British government and other people exactly what the Muslim Brotherhood is, which is a task in itself. I think you could set up a whole university course on just that question. In addition to that, I think we need to make it very clear to the government that if there is a improper process that takes place, then there could be legal action in respect to that, and that's partly why the Muslim Brotherhood has engaged the legal team in respect of making sure that things are done properly. I think it's also a very good opportunity for the Muslim Brotherhood to explain to the United Kingdom government and others about what it's been through in the last 12 months following the coup. What the Muslim Brotherhood has done in responding to a bloody and brutal removal from government is phenomenal. In my view, for the Muslim Brotherhood to have responded so peacefully and to demonstrate what the word non-violent opposition is, you couldn't have a better example than that. And so, Ian, in respect of what you asked, in what the Muslim Brotherhood fears, it doesn't fear anything in respect of the review. And that's why you may recall the initial press statement that the Muslim Brotherhood issued through my office in respect of the review. It very quickly decided that it would engage with a fair process. And that's the position that we're in today. I don't think there's really very much else to be said about the review other than that as long as the review is done properly and fairly and openly, there is nothing to fear.
Thank you. Can I just, I'd like to bring in Peter for a comment, but just before I do that, can I just say, there are two things that I'd like to mention on this. I mean, the question as to why is quite significant here. Why is the review called? I mean, that should, regardless of whether there is anything to fear or not, but the question is, why is this review announced, and why is it announced in the way, or formed in the way that, as Peter puts it, you know, the personnel involved, the process, the time frame, the such. Why is that? That must be a question that needs to be addressed. But there are two things here that I must say, that as the Cordoba Foundation and the wider Muslim, and by the way, I mean, when we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, in terms of individuals, I think we're talking about maybe a handful, maybe a couple of dozen. I really don't know, but not more than that. In terms of organization, again, we're not talking about anything, you know, substantial as far as I am aware. However, again, coming back to the messages I talked about just a while ago, the Muslim Brotherhood represents an idea, and that idea is about moderate Islam. That idea is subscribed by, I would suggest, by the overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world, of more than 1 billion people. That is the problem here. So if there was even the slightest chance that this organization and the ideas that it represents and the values that it shares and promotes are somehow seen to be in a shady light, now I'm with you. I don't think that there's going to be a proscription here. I don't think there's going to be a criminalization here. However, merely to leave it, you know, sort of questionable, with a few question marks hanging there, with one or two comments that some might wish to jump on and use and amplify, that would be problematic on so many levels for so many people, even those who don't really have any kind of direct affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. The other thing that I'd like to talk about and address here is that the track record in terms of engagement is extremely poor. It's not just a policy. It's the actual practicalities of engagement over the past 2 decades. All those who led and were prominent figures of the Arab Spring in the Arab world, and I can mention them, and their names mostly will be known to you, were people who resided in this country, some of whom in this particular city for decades. During their time here, no one from the Foreign Office, no one from the Home Office, no one from Whitehall chose to pick up the phone and say, you know, let's have a chat over tea, let me get to understand who you are. I want to know who you are. I want to know your ideas. Rashid al-Ghannouchi, for instance, who is now seen to be arguably the foremost person, you know, in personality in Tunisia. He was here in London for 20 years. No one picked up a phone from the government to say, you know, we want to engage with you and see exactly what you stand for. So now all of a sudden we're speaking to this person who's merely described to us through the lens of media, biased in any particular way, that is across the sea, when he was in our own backyard. And the same goes for so many individuals that were always also prominent individuals in Egypt, in Libya, and elsewhere. Unfortunately, even those in Libya who are now in government, some of whom we actually handed to the Gaddafi regime to torture and to extract information and confessions from. So anyway, so our track record in terms of engagement is extremely poor. And therefore, this comes within that particular framework of, unfortunately, a very poor, you know, engagement policy, and I think that is problematic. Also, and finally, and before I hand over to Peter, the narrative and discourse ongoing about political Islam is extremely skewed. It's wrong. The premise upon which it embarks is at fault. And therefore, unfortunately, the whole argument about political Islam now is fought on the wrong terms. And this, sadly enough, comes within that particular domain, within the idea of political Islam and what political Islam stands for. And again, because the whole discussion, the whole narrative is extremely skewed, the fear is that the review itself within that framework will also be affected by that in negative terms. So Peter, you want to say something?
And I think you should ask somebody else from the floor, actually.
Okay. I have, yes, I have Sahar, the Khalid, and then the gentleman just behind Sahar. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sahar from News again. My question is follow-up to AM and Barak. Maybe the review is not really the main concern because Muslim Brotherhood, they don't have anything to fear. But actually the biggest concern is other countries following up the same decisions that British government did. Let me give you an example. Tom Quiggin, the former Privy Council Intelligence Analysis, published a study arguing the Canadian government to deny public support and charity status to organizations aligned with Muslim Brotherhood. And he argued that the group promotes political Islam as an alternative to Western-style democracy. So I believe that's really the biggest concern. What are your comments on this?
Thank you. Can I take the batch of questions so that we come to the panel and just before we end? So, Khalid?
Khalid Al Citation for this forum. I think we've got to give a chance to Sir John Jenkins. He's been appointed, he's doing the inquiry. Why he's been appointed, I think there's many reasons. I think John Jenkins was quite close to David Cameron when he was actually in foreign before he was appointed to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia. My concern is that when they do this inquiry, that the inquiry reaches out to all sides and all people. Muslim Brotherhood, even the Egyptian government or the Egyptian embassy, and that there is a representative inquiry. Whichever way we look at it, this is, as far as I can say, it looks like an investigation into the merits of the Muslim Brotherhood being in Britain and its effects on Egypt.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman there, just in the third row. And I'll, absolutely, yes. And I'll come back to you as well. Yes, that's fine.
Thank you so much. I'm very intrigued by the question of what do you fear? And all of a sudden we moved into the defensive zone. We don't know, we don't fear anything. I think timing is very important. And let's put the sequence of events in order. And a coup has occurred. And then the Egyptian coup government stamped the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist group. And as a follow-up to that, there was an initiation of an inquiry. And what kind of perception that the people who don't know anything, when they hear this pieces of news on any news channel, and what kind of linkage? And interestingly enough, instead of asking the British government why didn't call the coup as a coup, why didn't ask the Egyptian coup government about that, on what legal basis you declared the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorist coup. I'm trying to answer the question now. What do you feel? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman next to you.
Hi there, Alistair Sloan. I have a question about the discourse regarding political Islam. I think if you ask the average kind of moderately educated, moderately interested person in the British street if they equate Islamism with democracy, they would almost certainly say no. And I think that's one of the really, really big problems with if Cameron announces an investigation of this type, he can get away with doing these things to Islamists because they're Islamists, in the same way that we can do some things to communists because they were communists. So I'm just wondering if you could identify where you think this problem has started and what can be done in specific terms to rectify it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mohammed Sudan here at the front. And then we have the gentleman and then Jamil Sheikh. Yes.
My name is Mohammed Sudan, Foreign Relations Secretary of the Freedom Justice Party. I just heard from Lord Ken Macdonald before he left that there is no relationship between the decision of the British government and the Parliament, the British Parliament, after they get the decision. I mean that the Parliament has nothing to do after the decision of the government. And if so, why is the Prime Minister David Cameron announced that of this review or investigation inside the British Parliament and make this kind of announcement in public and should be not in public?
Thank you. The gentleman here. second row.
So I'd like to make 2 points. The first one goes to the point that the other gentleman said, and indeed the Guardian journalist asked. Why is this troubling? Stop thinking about Islam and Muslim Brotherhood. This is troubling because it's a point of principle. To investigate a victim after they've been subject to a crime is essentially un-British, unfair, and wrong. And it is directly opposite to everything this country has stood for the last 1,000 years. That's the first point. The second point, which is why can Cameron and the others get over it? The problem is that the Muslim community in Britain, with some notable exceptions, have been too disengaged from local politics. Even when you have British Muslims, they tend to engage in the politics of their countries of origin rather than the local politics.
Yep.
And we have to learn. There were other immigrant communities, from the Huguenots to the Jews to others, who then engaged in British politics, and in so doing, actually managed to forward their case, not so much for the politics of their home countries, but for what they stand for. There's a lot of excellent work that is done in this country on the basis and the foundation of Islam. And it doesn't have to be stuff that's done, for example, by Muslim organizations. I called your attention on something that's done by the Prince of Wales. Mosaic is a charity that reaches out to Muslim communities in the deprived area, essentially run by people who work in it, not all of them, some of them are not, but many of them, because they derive the sense of community and commitment out of the sense of faith. Yep. There is a place for that.
Thank you very much. And then the final question, if I may. I'll make an exception for you, Dennis. Jamil, and then Dennis.
Yes, my name is Jamil Sharif. I was wondering whether, this is addressing Peter of one particular, in that while there have been, there could well have been international pressures for the review, don't you think that there's also an element of domestic politics involved, where it seems that there are political points to be scored by any critical view of Muslim activity, whether it is international or domestic, and the response is often a very opportunistic one, as you've seen recently with the government's intervention in state schools with Ofsted inspection. But no one can really understand why suddenly state schools are being subject to Ofsted inspection where there are Muslim governors. And I wonder whether really there are the advice is not coming from the Foreign Office, but through people like Michael Gove, who is well known for his ideological stance. And there's a certain, just like the weapons of mass destruction was a fabricated, the whole saga of fabrication, that is now appearing in other sections. Thank you.
Thank you. And next to you is Dennis, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dennis Fernando. I'm from a campaign called One Society, Many Cultures, and I agree very much with what people are saying about the timing of this review, given the death sentences that are happening at the moment in Egypt. And I think that it would be interesting to know people's thoughts on the fact that this seems to very much tally with the situation here in Britain in terms of the rise of Islamophobia and the climate around the Muslim community. So people make reference to the domestic situation. I just think in the last few weeks where we've seen the demonisation of the Muslim community around halal meat, where we've seen Operation Trojan Horse being suggested in the schools, which Jamil just referred to, and even look for Rahman, a situation where the police are charging into the Tower Hamlets Council in order to tarnish criminality upon Lutf Rahman, but then there being no charges. I think that this is part of a pattern, and the result of that is very, very clear, because you have a situation where Britain First paramilitary fascist group are charging into mosques around the country, and the Muslim Brotherhood's offices are being targeted by fascists. And I think that this is a completely counterproductive thing, because it ends up with people like the Muslim Brotherhood who want political engagement and political dialogue being completely and utterly demonised. And as people have said, in the eyes of the average person, the idea of criminality and other things being suggested. So I very much disagree with the way in which this whole thing has been set up and think that it is important to challenge the grounds on which it has been done.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I will give each of the panelists 2 to 3 minutes to sort of cover the main points, particularly the questions that were directed to them, before we wrap up. So shall I start with you, Muna? Do you want to go cover some of the points?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to start. There are quite a few questions. Well, I'd like to address a couple of sentiments here, which I don't have to be questions. First of all, again, it's a review, it's not an inquiry, and it's not an investigation. And governments are entitled to review their policies whenever they would like to, and we are very open, and we have nothing to hide, and we have nothing to be defensive about. So that is the position on that. And another point I'd like to actually, Anas has made earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood is an ideal. It's an idea of world Islam. There are a handful of Egyptian Muslim brothers, and that's why, coming after earlier questions, that this group of people this group of people are engaging with Egyptian politics. So there's no cross-regional interaction between the Muslim Brotherhood in different countries. Every Muslim Brotherhood is independent in its country. Even the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK is independent from the Muslim Brotherhood that work for Egypt from the UK, if I can put it this way. I represent the Brotherhood Office of Egypt. So I represent the press office of the Muslim Brotherhood that represents Egypt. So this is where I come from. I hope I didn't put it in a very complex way. But it's very, very important to realize that we are willing to engage. We are willing to open up. We want to engage in democracy. We want this chance. We can do it, and we've proven it over and over again. We are democratic, we believe in democracy. The founder of the Brotherhood himself participated in parliamentary elections. We don't want to force our will on the people. We want people to choose us into power. Once they do that, once they give us the mandate, it is not our right to give up this mandate. There was a mandate given to President Morsi. That's why we're holding up to the legitimacy of President Morsi, because it was a mandate given by the people for them to run. If the people don't want President Morsi, there's another elections that would come in and people would vote someone else in. So it's very, very important to realize that we as the Muslim Brotherhood, we want a chance to work out there. As soon as there was an opportunity in Egypt, we formed a political party maybe 3 months down the line. We want to engage. We want to engage with the media. We want to engage with politics. We want to be given a real chance to do the good which we believe in. We believe we have a message of goodness. And this message of goodness will bring betterment for Egypt, betterment for the region, and betterment for the entire world. And this is what we believe in.
Thank you.
Yes, to answer, I mean, the first point about this investigation is the timing, which is outrageous. I think it's Saudi Arabia and Egypt had declared the Brotherhood a terrorist organisation within weeks or just a couple of months beforehand. And for the British government, just I'm making an observation here about British foreign policy, should have protested vigorously against those decisions, particularly the decision in Egypt. It hasn't even managed to call what happened in Egypt a coup d'etat. Its condemnations of the massacres after the coup d'etat were incredibly muted. And so its first meaningful action is to have a look at whether or not the Brotherhood is a terrorist organisation. Is really an endorsement, it's a sort of slur on the Brotherhood. And it falls into a pattern of the British government colluding with an illegal coup d'etat and using the language of that coup d'etat. And it's a disgrace that it should have happened. And then to move on to the question which was directed at me, I do think this inquiry has to be seen in the context of the treatment of Brotherhood-linked organisations in this country. However, I don't have any doubt. I don't think that my friend Gove, I hold him responsible for a great deal, and many of them good things. I love many of the things he's doing in schools, but I don't think that he has anything to do with the decision. He clearly came, I've started to research it and find out what happened. It clearly came from pressure from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states via the Foreign Office in Downing Street. And I don't think it was done specifically or triggered in any way by domestic considerations on this occasion.
Thank you, Peter. Maha?
There were many good points that were made. Let me just touch on a couple of things. One, in terms of, will this kind of policy or review be taken up by other countries? And someone mentioned Canada and the kind of fear-mongering that's happening towards the Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere among certain groups in different countries. Clearly there are organized groups of Egyptians in particular that are supportive of the military regime. They may be a minority, but they're well organized. They play on the fears of the community at large against Islam in general and of the Brotherhood in particular. And this is something that is increasing and has gained some traction. I think there is the issue of who is the government, particularly here in the UK and elsewhere, listening to. They listen to the Egyptian embassy, to diplomats. The Egyptian regime has been very active in sending individuals and delegations to speak to those governments and to pressure them. Facts are often fabricated, and again they play on this fear-mongering factor and stereotyping of the Brotherhood. It's not that Western governments don't know. In some cases they do know, in others there is a very confused and muddled picture that's being presented to them. There are trade missions that continue to come and go, saying, we need investments, we have good ties. So there's pressure from all sides, from the region, on governments to not be sympathetic to the Brotherhood, and if anything, all right, the governments won't prescribe them, but ultimately the idea is to normalize relations with Egypt and in turn to relegate the Brotherhood into a kind of position where their activities, if you like, are seen as circumspect. Even though those activities, as we heard from the gentleman from Stop the War, have helped the communities at large and have been important. And we're not talking about an organization as such, but Brotherhood individuals or sympathizers have supported causes that are important to many in this country and across the world. Causes to do with justice and so on, and a call for peace against engagement in war. So I think what we're seeing is a major challenge, not only for the Muslim community, but for all political sectors in society and individuals and all those concerned, one with civil liberties and with the upholding of human rights, to say that we must not victimize a particular group based on the politics of authoritarian states in a different part of the world that are pressuring democratic governments like that of the UK. And I think that is at the heart of the matter, that we must raise our voices in saying we do not want the UK government, a democracy, and British society to be to be hoodwinked into believing that the Brotherhood is a threat, when the Brotherhood, as we've said many times today, has engaged in democratic politics, believes in democratic politics and non-violence, and believes in civil society, and ultimately to succumb to the pressures of authoritarian states like that of Egypt today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On everyone's behalf, I'd like to thank the panelists for today. al-Qazzaz, Peter Oborne, Maha Azzam, and Lord Macdonald, who was with us earlier. Just two announcements I'd like to make before I wrap up. Firstly, there was an article recently in The Independent about the Finsbury Park Mosque, the formerly notorious Finsbury Park Mosque. And in it is a commentary about how those affiliated with the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood actually solved that particular problem for, for Britain, for everyone here in Britain. So I would urge you to go back to that. Also, if you can set your diaries to the 9th of June, the Cordoba Foundation is holding a joint event with the University of Westminster, and it's titled Governance, Islamic Law and Conflict Resolution, an Islamic Approach. This is going to be with a panel of Professor John Esposito from Georgetown University, Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi from Westminster University, and Imam Shafi Al-Rahman from Jibreel Institute here in London. I would urge you to, the flyer is in your pack. Finally, I'd like to thank all our volunteers and helpers and all the sister organizations that worked with us tirelessly over the past couple of weeks to put this event together and to make it what you have seen it is. And finally, thank you, each and every one of you, for being here today. Your participation, your presence and your contribution has been extremely valuable. I appreciate everything. I apologize if I've made any errors or shortcomings. My name is Anas Altikriti. I look forward to seeing you next time round. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.